Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to Resurrection Parish. And we are gifted to have a wonderful speaker with us here tonight. My name is Lisa Polk. I'm the Director of Pastoral Services for the Archdiocese of Regina. And you are not here to see me tonight. You're here to listen to Father Ron Rolheiser, who is gracing us with his presence from San Antonio, Texas, is where he lays his hat most recently. So if you'll join me with a short opening prayer, and then I will pass it over to Father Ron. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Creator God, we thank you for the gift of today. We thank you for the gift of allowing people to gather and to drive here safely. We ask you to get us home safely again. Bless our families who may be with us and not with us tonight. And we just ask you to open our ears and our minds and our hearts to what it is that you have in store for us via Father Ron. We ask these things through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, so Father Ron, if you please join me in welcoming Father Ron Rolheiser.
Good evening. First question, how is the sound? Everybody can hear? The back, thumbs up. Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Lisa, who invited me, and Bishop Don to bring me here. It's a pleasure to be home. You know, I'm a Saskatchewan boy. I will always be a Saskatchewan boy, although now I'm an old boy. Okay. I live in the United States now, but in the United States, I have a green card. I'm called an illegal alien. So here I'm not an alien, I'm home. So it really is it's a pleasure to be able to come back here, and it's a privilege. Okay. It's a test of microphones to begin with. I'm going to give you the two best religious puns I heard this year. So you got to be quick. A pun is... So this is the first one. There was a Buddhist monk. And one day he was praying, and he looked into some margarine, and he saw the face of Jesus. And he said, "I can't believe it's not Buddha." Okay. Second little story was, this is the Christmas scene. Mary and Joseph at the crib, and the shepherds come, and they do their thing. And then the wise men came, and they started bringing the gifts. The first wise men laid down some gold, and Mary and Joseph, being poor people, they had never seen gold before, and they were simply blown away by this. It's just wonderful, this is wonderful. They kept gushing how wonderful this was. And then they laid down some frankincense, and they said, "This is just too much." And the wise men said, wait, there is myrrh. Okay, it's just to test the microphones, okay. Our topic tonight is called Bridging the Unbridgeable Gap Beyond Polarization in the Church and Society. Bridging the Unbridgeable Gap Beyond Polarization in the Church and Society. And I've subtitled it called Love in a Time of Hatred. Love in a Time of Hatred, Some Commandments for the Long Haul. Okay. I want to begin with just a couple of quotes, almost like as a gathering hymn, to serve as a gathering hymn. The first comes from a man called Roosevelt Montaz. He says, "When reacting to a bad opinion, don't ask, in what way is this wrong? But in what way is this right?" Then, three quotes from, I don't know if you know who Arthur Brooks is. He's a New York writer, and he's written a book on polarization and contempt. Three quotes from him. He says, "Moral courage, it's not standing up for your own side, it's standing up for the side that's not your side." Then he says, "Don't argue with hatred." Okay, I'll come back to that. Then he also says, "How well is your hatred working out for you?" Okay. And then Thomas Aquinas says, when Jesus says, "Love your enemy," it means love your enemy notwithstanding your feelings about your enemy. And Daniel Berrigan, he says, the question is, how to love your enemy while your life stands in opposition to him. So there's some little quotes to almost to serve as a gathering hymn. But I want to start with the question of the gap, the unbridgeable gap. Bridging the unbridgeable gap. That unbridgeable gap is taken from Scripture. I'm sure you all know the story, it's a famous story in Scripture about the rich man and Lazarus. So Jesus tells a parable. He said there was a rich man, and he dined sumptuously every night, and at his gate there was a poor man called Lazarus. And Lazarus said even the dogs were licking his sores, and he'd gladly have eaten the scraps from the rich man's table, but the rich man didn't give him any. And the rich man died, and Lazarus died. And Lazarus went to heaven, and the rich man went to hell. Okay, so Jesus says this story. The rich man's in hell, and he sees Lazarus up in heaven in Abraham's bosom. And he says to Abraham, send him down here, and he can give me a drop of water, just some drop of water on my tongue, because I'm dying down here. And Abraham says, no. Abraham says, there's an unbridgeable gap between the two of you. Between you and Lazarus, there's an unbridgeable gap that can never be bridged. Okay? Now, a little further in the story, then he says, well, at least warn my brothers that they don't end up like I am. And Abraham said, they got Moses and the prophets. If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't listen to Lazarus. They said, but if a dead man came back, they'd listen to him. He said, no, they won't. Because the dead man had already come back. That was written long after the resurrection. But I want to get to the unbridgeable gap. He said, between us, there's an unbridgeable gap. We've always misinterpreted that text to make that there's an unbridgeable gap between heaven and hell. If you're in heaven or someone's in hell, that gap can never be bridged. That's not what this text is about. Okay. The text is not so much an unbridgeable gap between heaven and hell. And the unbridgeable part is not that it's impossible realistically to bridge the gap. It's, pardon the terminology, it's an existential thing that can never be bridged. Which means it's not that God says, that's it. You've made your choice, and that can't be bridged. No. It means if we live in a certain way long enough, the gap can't be bridged. It's a little bit if you have a fight in your family and you don't talk to your brother for 45 years, there's a pretty good chance it's an unbridgeable gap, you know. In fact, the parable of Jesus is very interesting. That parable that Jesus gives, that comes from an older Jewish parable, and Jesus cuts it off. He doesn't give the whole parable. But in the parable, the original, God gives the rich man, a chance to come back to earth. He said, go back to earth and change your life. And he goes back to earth, and now he's learned his lesson. But he's been dead for a while, so when he gets back, first thing he's going to buy some food. So he hitches his wagon, he drives to the store, and he buys a lot of food. And as he's coming back to his house, gets to the gate, here's Lazarus sitting. Lazarus says, give me a loaf of bread. Now he's learned his lesson. Jumps off the wagon, absolutely. And as he's reaching for the bread, he says, this is a beggar. He doesn't need a whole loaf. I'll give him a half loaf. He says, well, he doesn't even need a half. I can give him some of the spoiled bread. 10 minutes later, he's back in hell. Okay, see, the gap is unbridgeable on our side. It's an existential gap. It's not an ontological gap, if you pardon the terminology. So that it's not like between heaven and hell, it can't be bridged. There is nobody, I can say this, if there's anybody in hell, they're not saying, if I had 10 minutes over, I'd live my life different. God says, take 10 years if you want it. We don't change. Also, it points out the gap that exists is also unbridgeable between the rich and the poor. There's somehow in our society, there's an unbridgeable gap between the rich and the poor. We just never get that gap bridged. Not because it's impossible, because we don't do it. Now, today there's a big gap in our society. And that is that I said we live in a time of hatred. So we are divided today. I live in the United States, and maybe worse than here. But the United States, I don't think that country has been this divided since the Civil War. So the government is stalemated. People hate each other. Nothing can operate. People demonize each other. And some wear MAGA hats, and some are the very opposite of that. So there's powerful polarization, okay? And not just polarization, there's hatred. There's hatred, and a thing I'm going to talk about separately, there's a lot of contempt. So that there's contemptuousness on both sides. You're just stupid, or you're just this liberal communist, and you're just whatever, and so on. And a lot of demonization. These people are evil. These people are badly intended. You know, I don't think it's that much different in Canada. You know, and then there's a lot of ideological camps. Pro-life and pro-choice. Democrat, Republican. This, that. You know, for vaccinations, against vaccinations. Believe this, don't believe this, and so on. So you have that, and then you have, what you have here, you have more than 1 billion information sites. So that today with social media, everybody can find whatever information they want. And they do find it. I'm old enough to remember when I was a kid, here in Canada, in the entire country, we had one TV channel, CBC. You watched CBC or you watched nothing. And then later on, we got two at CTV and said, how can you cope with 2 television channels? Now we have hundreds of television channels and just billions of websites and podcasts and so on that it's impossible, and everybody can find whatever they want. It's like the Tower of Babel. We're speaking different languages and so on. You know, you can always get good wit from comedians. And the other day, a comedian says, you know, he said, they have all these streaming sites now, you know, so that, you know, you have all these streaming sites. So somebody's actually developing one app to bring all these streaming sites together. He said, that's marvelous, but it already exists. It's called cable, okay? But you know, there's this proliferation of information, and then also we've lost a common sense of morality. What's right and what's wrong? You used to be able to be shamed if you did something wrong. Today you can't be. Say, so what? You're a liar, you're a thief, you're a rapist, so what? It's your problem. Okay, I'm not exaggerating this. This is, you watch the news at night, and then also a loss of a common sense of truth. So then what's true? Is 2 and 2 equal 4? Is that still valid? Or you've done your own research and found out that it could mean something else. So we are a society and a church and even families that are deeply, deeply divided. You know, when families get together today, there are taboo topics. You can't talk about this. You know, churches can't talk about certain things. Governments can't talk about certain things. That's the unbridgeable gap. How do you bridge that gap? So that's the diagnosis. Where do you go in terms of, you know, a response to this? Well, Jesus gave us 10 commandments, so I'm going to give you 10 commandments. 10 commandments for bridging this gap. The first one is this. We need to resist the temptation to try to win this with better arguments and better apologetics. You know, we need to realize this is not going to be won by better arguments. If you are dealing with somebody who's against vaccinations or against this or that, the stronger your arguments, the more you're going backwards. Okay? But it's true of everything. Because in the end, these aren't intellectual issues, they're emotional. They're issues of emotion, of self-protection, of history, of wound, of ethnicity, and 1,000 other things that fit in. So a story to illustrate that. Cardinal Newman was a great theologian, and he's a great Christian, but he had a brother who was an agnostic. And his brother would just be on his case all the time. How can you believe this? How can you believe that? And Jesus rose from the dead. How do you believe that? And how can you believe this? And for years and years, Newman would argue with his brother. Try to make arguments and a better apologetics, and you got to read this person and so on. And then he came to a realization. One day he told his brother, we're not going to argue anymore. No more arguments. He said, because your problem isn't intellectual, this is emotional. You know, your emotions aren't guided by your intellect. They are wild horses, and they're set in motion by your history, by everything inside of you, and you don't command them, and they don't follow reason. I was once sitting beside a man at a church, and he had a squirming grandchild, and it was then finally the grandchild says, "Grandpa, I'm so bored." The grandfather says, "You're not bored." Okay. Well, I'm sure that cured the issue. So if any of you are bored right now, you're not bored. Okay. See, you can't command an emotion. Don't get angry. Don't be angry. Don't feel that way. Don't be bored and so on. Those are wild horses that just come. And they don't respond to the intellect. The old Catholic Catechism, I love this piece of wisdom. In the old Catholic Catechism, they had something we called imperfect contrition. We need to dig that out and dust it off. What was imperfect contrition? They said, if you do something that's wrong, and you should feel sorry, but you can't, you're actually glad you did it. They said, well, then what you have to do, if you can feel bad and sorry about the fact that you can't feel sorry, that's not perfect contrition, it's imperfect contrition, but it's enough for forgiveness. See, that's a way of, honoring the emotions. Your emotions are going to be what they are. I'll give you a simple example of that. Capital punishment. As Christians, and this is clear, we're told capital punishment should not be done. It should not be done. But you know something? Every time an unrepentant, angry, murderous person is killed, we feel good. There's an emotional release. But because there's an emotional release, doesn't mean we should do it. Incidentally, that's called catharsis, and we get that mixed up with closure. When we still have capital punishment in some states, including Texas, and so on. And there's always people protesting for capital punishment said, that brings closure to the families. That brings closure to society. That's justice which brings closure. Does it? No. It brings a feeling, an emotional feeling called catharsis. Catharsis is what you feel at the end of a movie. When the bad guy has been oppressing people and terrorizing people and bullying people, and finally he gets shot at the end, and you could sleep. That's a catharsis. But that's a drug, that doesn't do anything for you. Makes you feel good and you can sleep, Tell you what catharsis is. Closure. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber, he set up a bomb that killed 162 people. And he died unrepentant, or at least seemingly so. But he had been a Catholic altar boy, grew up in Buffalo. And his parents were pretty upset by what he did and so on. And there was a woman who got killed in the Oklahoma bombings, and her parents flew to Buffalo, New York, and they befriended McVeigh's parents. And while he was being executed, the two sets of parents were saying the rosary together. That's closure. That's closure. It's not catharsis, See, because the emotions are going to have their say, okay? And see, in so many of these divisions, the unbridgeable gap, it's an emotional gap. It's not an intellectual gap. We can have the best arguments in the world, they don't go anywhere. We need to bridge the emotional gap. How do we do this? Okay, secondly, by resisting contempt. What lies at the root of a lot of this unbridgeableness is contempt. And what contempt is disgust plus anger, or anger plus disgust. And it's the worst thing we can offer each other. Marriage counselors will tell you this. They say, what breaks up a marriage? Not just anger or whatever, or certain dysfunction, it's contempt. Because there's a complete loss of respect. I can't even be in a house with you, That's more than hatred. That's hatred with contempt, And with Arthur Brooks in his book, he says we have to be really proactive in turning down the flames or the influences that inflame contempt. The influences that inflame contempt. And here, I'll use myself as an example. I watched the news at night with a couple of colleagues, and pretty soon we're into it. This guy's terrible. This guy, how can they be that stupid? And so on. See, we're inflaming our contempt. And actually, sometimes you need that release with other people and so on. But we have to be careful that it's not just an emotional release, that we're not just inflaming contemptuousness, which breaks down all respect, which makes the gap completely unbridgeable. So thirdly, we're moving along here in the commandments, and that is you tell the truth. You know, this is only going to be solved by if we have to tell the truth no matter what the consequences. And I want to emphasize this because today there is not a lot. Our culture has a very loose relationship to truth. You know, a lot of truths are inconvenient, so we're not going to say it, you know. There is no global warming. The Holocaust didn't happen. We didn't mistreat the natives. There was no slavery in the United States, and so on. Those are lies. Those are basic lies, you know. And see, they're inconvenient truths that we can't face. Now, little footnote, and those who were here on the day-to-day patience, because this is repetitious, and so on. So, you know that truth-telling, or the opposite, in Scripture, the very worst thing you can commit, the very worst sin you commit is the sin of lying. That Satan is not the prince of peace, of pride, and Satan is not the prince of sex, and Satan isn't the prince of violence. Satan is the prince of lies. The single most dangerous thing you can do is to lie. Why do I say this? Okay, because Jesus said it. Okay. You know, in Scripture, you have this thing, and I don't know if you've ever teased this out. What is the unforgivable sin against the Holy Spirit, and why is it unforgivable? Remember, Jesus says, there's one sin. You can do any kind of sin or blaspheme, but if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, you're guilty of an eternal sin that can never be forgiven. You ever wondered if you committed that sin? Well, if you're in this church, I'm pretty sure you haven't. Okay. It begins with lying. Remember the context. Jesus had just cast out a demon. And in their religion at the time, this was a dogma. They believed that only someone who comes from God could cast out a demon. Okay? And Jesus had just cast out a demon, but they hated him, and this was an inconvenient truth. So they said, well, he did it by the devil. He did it by Beelzebub. And first, Jesus tries arguing with them. No, you argue against an emotion. You know, he says, well, that wouldn't make any sense. Then Satan's house would be divided. You know, Satan's house would fall. But they persist, and Jesus said, be careful, be careful. There's many sins you can commit. They'll be forgiven. But if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, you're guilty of an eternal sin that can never be forgiven. Okay, what's the sin? Notice it begins with lying. Lying is dangerous. Why? The first time you do it, it's not a problem. The second time you do it, it's no problem. The third time you do it, it's not a problem. The 300th time you do it, it is a problem. And the problem is you slowly begin to believe your own lie. And then what happens is you warp your conscience so that truth looks like falsehood and falsehood looks like truth. And after a while you see heaven as hell and hell as heaven, and you see truth as falsehood and falsehood as truth. You see light as darkness. And the reason it's unforgivable is you don't want to be forgiven. If there's anybody in hell, there's nobody in hell, as I said, to say, God, if you give me 10 minutes over, I'll make an act of contrition. Say, take 10 years, you know. If there's anybody in hell, they're feeling sorry for people in heaven. They say, if you want that garbage, go there, you know. You think that's joy? You think that's happiness? See, that's a warped spirit. But it begins by lying. It's Martin Luther, great line on this. Martin Luther says, sin honestly. God can handle weakness. God cannot handle lies, you know, because the danger is we begin to believe our own lies. And then at a certain point, we lose our moral compass. There's no more moral compass left. And you begin to see truth as falsehood and falsehood as truth, and so on. And today, I emphasize that. I did a big piece on this afternoon because that is the biggest moral issue in our culture. What scares me more than anything else in our culture is, what's truth? There isn't any more truth. Everybody has their own truth, And, comedians who sometimes have their own issues, but sometimes they help us. So you want some of these late night shows, and they get on this. And I won't mention any names, but they'll say, this politician says, I never said that. I absolutely never said that. They'll show 10 clips where he said it. He said, but I never said that. Well, that isn't just playing around with God, it's also playing around with our own sanity. There's some says, well, the Holocaust never happened. Slavery never happened. Well, what does that do with your sanity, not alone to history? But see, that's part of the unbridgeable gap, is that there's no more truth-telling. The single thing you have to do to go to heaven is to not lie. No matter how weak, Jesus says, weakness I can forgive. I can't forgive lying when it leads to a warped conscience. When you're standing before St. Peter said, I never did any of those things. Okay, you did. Okay. Fourth, never bracket the essentials in all fruitful dialogue. There are 3 words. I want you to imprint them into your mind today. Just 3 words. Charity, respect, graciousness. Charity, respect, graciousness. Say it a third time. Charity, respect, graciousness. That has to be under the substratum of all dialogue, and today it's almost completely absent in all dialogue. Whether it's in the governments, whether it's in the church, whether it's in, there's simply no respect, no graciousness, we hate each other. And, and there's contempt inside of that, and so on. This can never be bridged, You're an awful person, you're stupid, but I'm going to straighten you out. Good luck with that, Psychologists will tell you this. They said, to challenge something, it's only fruitful if this is the substratum. They said, you can challenge somebody hard, and it'll be effective only if they first know that you love and respect them. Then they'll hear it. Otherwise, you just have goods on them. Let me tell you how dumb you are. Let me tell you what your faults are. It drives you further into your foxholes, See, it has to come out of charity, out of love. I'm concerned about you. Respect, charity. When they do interventions, there's preventionals, involved in a number of interventions. You have to put somebody away to a clinic or wherever. And you always get a professional psychologist working with you, but this is always the line. They say, you're far too good a person to be doing this stuff. You don't say, you awful person, why the hell are you doing this stuff? You start with, you're just too good a person. You're too good a person to be doing this. We love you, we're trying to help you, See, that's different than, how can you do that, and how can you be so stupid, and how can you betray your vocation, and so on. Okay, that's the fourth one. Be gracious. Remember, charity, graciousness, respect, and they're non-negotiable. When I say non-negotiable in this sense that so often we think our cause is so strong that we can do this. I'm pro-life or pro-choice, and this is so important that I can be in your face and disrespect you. No, you can't. You can't. That's going to increase the gap rather than bridge the gap. Okay, number 5. We need to have a virtue that's deeper than the virtue of the scribes and the Pharisees. At one point in Scripture, in the Sermon on the Mount, which is Jesus' basic moral, the highest moral sermon, and at the high point of this, he lays this line on us. He says, your virtue needs to be deeper than the virtue of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, that is a very easy thing to misunderstand, because in Scripture, oftentimes the scribes and Pharisees don't get good ink. They're hypocritical, and they're going to be the people who get Jesus crucified and so on. But that's not what he's saying here. The scribes and Pharisees were the good religious people of the time. today in this church, we're the scribes and Pharisees today. Those were the practicing Jewish, believing Christians. There's a slip of the tongue. Jesus was a Pharisee. Paul was a Pharisee. These were good people, and they had a high virtue. Notice Jesus didn't say, if you're hypocritical, like the scribes and Pharisees said, you have to have a virtue that's deeper than theirs. What was their virtue? Well, in fact, their virtue was a very high virtue. To be a good scribe or Pharisee, you had to keep all the 10 commandments, all 10, and you had to be a woman or a man of true justice, that you could never cheat anybody. You had to be all the 10 commandments, and you had to be a just person. And Jesus said, that's not good enough. Really? Why is that not good enough? He said, if you keep all the commandments and you're a just woman or a man, then he goes on to specify why it's not good enough. He said, because, he said, in justice, anybody can hate those who hate you. Anybody can love those who love you. Anybody can bless those who bless you, just as anybody can curse those who curse you. He's saying this, you can be a just man or woman and not be very loving at all. Because what we do is we simply feed back the energy. Someone says to you, I hate you. Well, I hate you too. Someone comes up and says, I think you're a wonderful priest. I think, well, you're a wonderful parishioner. And that's justice. Incidentally, in justice, you can do capital punishment. John Paul II, I give him full credit for this. John Paul II was the first pope in history, pope since Peter, who came out and said, we shouldn't do capital punishment. He didn't say it was wrong. Now, Francis has gone further and said it's wrong. John Paul said, it's not wrong. You're allowed to do it. It's justice. He said, but we shouldn't do it because Jesus calls us to something higher. Jesus says, bless those who curse you. Do good to those who do evil to you. Be gracious to those who hate you. Forgive those who murder you. That's moral theology at its highest level. In fact, and that is where Jesus stretches us further than any moral teacher. He said, can you forgive a murderer? Can you love somebody who hates you? Can you bless somebody who curses you? And so on. See, that's taking your virtue further than the scribes and Pharisees, and so on. And see, that is what we're going to need to bridge the unbridgeable gap. Because if we return contempt for contempt, hatred for hatred, demonization for demonization, we just stay there. The stalemate has to be broken by you reach across, Someone says, I hate you, but I don't hate you, You murdered somebody, we're going to forgive you, and so on. That's very different than you also need to be killed. And that's where Jesus really stretches us. It's interesting, little footnote on that. So oftentimes we have it in Catholicism, they have it in evangelicalism, Protestantism, and so on too. And that is, what makes for a practicing Christian? So what makes for a practicing Catholic? And we used to define that very simply. You went to Mass and you kept the sixth commandment. Those were the two. It was very simple. Practicing Catholic, you went to Mass on Sundays, you kept the sixth commandment. Didn't say, well, you might hate your neighbor, you might not care about the poor, and so on. Whoa, what about that? See, we just conveniently cherry-picked, So I'll give you an example, which I often run into with groups and so on, where you'll get the religious right, and they'll say, you look at, for instance, Western Europe. Look at a lot of those liberal democratic countries, the Netherlands, Sweden, and so on. They'll say they're completely post-Christian. They are completely post-Christian. They say, look, less than 10% of the people go to Mass. They have euthanasia, abortion, prostitution. It's completely post-Christian. Okay? You say, well, something? Sweden, Netherlands, they take care of their poor better than any country in the whole world. That's a mammoth moral Christian achievement. I live in the United States, where there's a lot of, religious right. We don't take care of our poor at all. We live in the richest country in the world, and 1 out of 4 kids goes to bed hungry at night. And the gap between the rich and the poor is just astronomical. And people die because they can't get Medicare, But we're Christian. We go to church and so on. So who's more Christian? Sweden or United States? If you just look at church attendance. Now, I'm not saying what's happening there is all okay too, but we both cherry pick, So someone said, well, the poor, what's that got to do with morality? Well, I'll try a Jesus line on you. Jesus begins his ministry, he says, I have come to bring good news to the poor. So bluntly put, any preaching, any teaching that isn't good news to the poor is not the gospel of Jesus. It may not just be good news for the rich. It's got to be good news for the poor. That's Jesus. I've come to bring good news to the poor. There's a very colorful black pastor in New York, Pastor Forbes. I love his expression. He says, nobody is going to get to heaven without a letter of recommendation from the poor. You're not going to heaven if you don't have a letter of recommendation from the poor. Jesus, I've come to bring good news to the poor. See, so Jesus, what makes a practicing Christian, it's not one moral thing, abortion or whatever. Not that those things aren't important. Euthanasia, it's, can you have a virtue deeper than the scribes and the Pharisees? Can you love an enemy? And that's very important. I'll tell you why. Because we're going to be in heaven with a lot of people. And they're all going to be different. There's a wonderful black theologian in Chicago called Gloria Previs, young theologian. She always says, I try to get along with everybody, realize I'm going to have to spend eternity with them. You want to take that line home. Try to get along with everybody. You're going to have to spend eternity with them. John Shea, who's one of my favorite theologians, and John Shea says, he said, the heavenly banquet table. He said, it's one condition to go to heaven. He said, the table is open to everyone who's willing to sit down with everyone. That's quite a condition. If we're not willing to sit down with everybody, we can't be in heaven. They can't have separate tables. Democrats here, liberals there, pro-life on one table, pro-choice on another table, and so on. It would be earth. Garrison Keillor is one of my favorite comedians. Garrison Keillor says, I'm a pious Lutheran. He said, I think I'm going to go to heaven. He said, but what section? He said, imagine they put you in with the Mormons and there's no coffee. He said, it'd be one hell of a price to pay for eternal life, No, there's going to be one table. So we got to get used to each other, which means we have to forgive enemies. We have to move beyond strict justice. Okay, number 6. Be rooted in Jesus and not in ideology. It sounds pious, it's not. Be rooted in Jesus and not in ideology. What does that mean? Begin with a story. There's a woman, I forget her name. She's a ordained Episcopalian priest out of San Francisco. But for the last about 20 years, she's been doing mainline work on ecology. So she goes around the country, about doing stuff for the planet and recycling and composting and, having a, Laudato Si and so on. So she's being interviewed on a Texas radio station. So this interviewer said, you come out of San Francisco, a very liberal place, and you have all this, ecological stuff. Says, how does that go over in Arkansas? Or how does it go over, in West Texas and some of those conservative places? How does it go over there? She gave a very good answer. Said, I've learned something from traveling around the country. I've learned this. She says, if I come out of Jesus, if I come out of the Gospels, sincere people will hear me. Said, if I come out of ideology, they'll turn me off like a water tap. Said, if I come out of the Gospels, if I come out of Jesus, sincere people are going to hear me. If I come out of ideology, people can turn me off like a water tap. What's the difference between Jesus and ideology? Well, ideologies carry a lot of truth, but you can say, well, that's feminist. I'm not going to do this. That's LGBTQ ideology. I'm not going to do that. That's coming out of an ideology. Now, there may be a lot of truth to that, but we can reject it, say, well, that's just politically correct. Tell a story here because it's a flattering story for him, but when I was in Saskatoon as provincial, I was in the priest's council. There's a great story about James Mahoney, the bishop. So he comes to the priest's council one month and he says, we got to pay our diocesan workers a better wage. They're not getting a just wage. And the priests, good priests, all of us had said, oh, we'd like to, but we can't afford it. We just can't afford it. We don't have the budget for it. And he said, well, no, this is the gospel. We have to make the budget for it. And he said, now, I'm going to leave it for a month, because they might have a vote today, but next month we're going to have a vote that we do it or we don't do it, you know. So next month we have a vote, and they voted it down. Good priests, you know. So man, he said, I do very little by executive, because as a bishop, he can do this by executive order. He said, but I'm doing this. And one of his priests, who was a very close friend of his, says, Jim, you're just doing that because it's politically correct. He said, no, we're doing it because it's correct. Notice, something can be politically correct, but it's also correct. But a lot of times, if it's coming at you as political correctness, this is LGBTQT, this is feminism, this is whatever. These are just, ecological warriors. For instance, Greenpeace. Greenpeace does a lot of good. They're worried about the planet, but they're an ideology. So people can say, I don't have to deal with Greenpeace, but we have to deal with the gospel. See, so in all of our movements towards each other, we have to be really careful that we're not coming out of ideology. Well, she's a feminist. That's the LGBTQ. This is something else, That can be turned off, And it's not that those people don't have a lot of truths. Greenpeace has a lot of truth. Feminism has a lot of truth. LGBTQ, there's a lot of truth there, but it can't come at you at an ideology. So we have to reach out to each other in a non-ideological way. Bluntly put, don't define yourself as liberal and don't define yourself as conservative. Just don't define yourself. I'll ask you this question. Was Jesus a liberal or conservative? You can't answer that question. He was all over the map. Sometimes he was radical liberal and sometimes he's radical conservative. He was fully compassionate. Go where compassion takes you, not where an ideology takes you. And if you you can learn truths from ideologies, but don't use them as ideologies. Now, and maybe this is the most important point of all, number 7, use hospitality as your major weapon. Remember I said, this is our emotional issues. These are issues of history, of wound, of everything else that form our emotions and so on. Why are some people anti-vaxxers and some violent vaxxers? A lot has to do with your background and why do some people accept it, others don't? Okay. So what we need, how do you break down emotion? How do you break down history? How do you break down misunderstanding? How do you break down hurt? You do it with hospitality. So here's a story. Okay. Mary Jo Letty, wonderful woman who runs Romero House in Toronto, tells this story. Powerful story. She said, the Romero House is a house for refugees. And as you know, refugees are not easily accepted. Today a lot of people just, no refugees, no refugees. So she set up these 2 houses in Toronto, and they're in a pretty affluent area. So somebody gave her those properties, and so there's 2 big houses in a very affluent area of Toronto, and she starts bringing all these refugees from all over the world, and the neighbors went ballistic. The neighbors just like, you can't have these people here. They're going to, steal from our houses. They're going to, rape our women. And all this stuff's going to happen. You can't have these people in this. This is a good neighborhood. And she said it took 10 years. It took 10 years to break that down. And eventually, they broke it down in every single person. So you know how we did it? Said, we never argued. Said, we just became good neighbors. We just became good neighbors. But she tells one particular powerful story. Said they had a man, an older man, single, living by himself, who was particularly negative. They're here and they can't get jobs, and they're going to steal from us, and they're probably rapists, and there's this and that, and so on. So she said, one day there was a big snowstorm, and he's an older man, and this young African girl, 14 years old, without being asked, she went over and began to shovel his sidewalk. So he comes out, and he's angry. He said, what do you think you're doing here? She said, well, I'm shoveling your sidewalk. He said, you think I'm going to pay you? I'm not going to pay you. He said, no, you don't have to pay me. He said, then why are you doing this? He said, because you're old. Okay. It's a pretty good reason. You're an old man, So he stomped in the house. She kept shoveling. After a while, he comes out and said, where are you from? And he gets her in a conversation. He befriended her. Then he befriended the community. And now he's one of their biggest supporters. He says, no, those are good people. Those are good people. Notice that wore him down was a young girl shoveling a sidewalk, saying, I'm doing this for you because you're old and I'm young, That broke through just walls of emotion, okay? They could never have sat down with him. Let me explain who these people are and where they're from. He had to meet a young girl and befriend her, and then he befriended the house, But that's the paradigm of where we need to go. That is our ultimate weapon. We just have to be good, hospitable neighbors to each other, And eventually it wears it down. It's the only thing that's going to break emotions, It's not going to be big arguments, And after all, say, well, she's a nice person, whatever, and so on. Okay, that's important, and that's a big piece. Then number 8, we have to offer space for disagreement and anger. That is one of the big problems in our culture. We today, in our churches, in our society, we don't have a space where people can come together to express disagreement and anger. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in our churches. It doesn't exist in our governments and so on. Incidentally, that is what Francis is trying to do with synodality. We're going to offer you space, different people to come and sit together and just express who you are and what you believe in. But I'll give you one major example, abortion. Scholars who in Gallup polls and people who do research in that, they'll say that 85% of North Americans actually agree on abortion and what should happen, but it's never going to happen. Why? Because the two sides will never let that conversation happen. They've demonized each other, so that, for instance, pro-life is landed where that is the only moral issue there is. And pro-choice is that it's not a moral issue at all. Okay, hello? There's got to be some space in the middle where really 85% of the people are, but there's 85%. We're never going to have that dialogue. We can't have a dialogue on abortion. We can't really have a dialogue on LGBTQT. We can't have a dialogue on, it's happening a little bit now on indigenous people. We can't have a dialogue on blacks in the United States and so on because it's just too polarized. And so what happens is, what sensitive people do, which is most of you? We just walk away from it. We practice what I call emotional apartheid, which is just, I'll live in my world, you live in yours, and we're just going to have to make do. See, so we don't know how to fight. We don't know how to come together and have a disagreement. So we don't come together. We simply never have that dialogue talk on abortion, on LGBTQT, or whatever else it is, and so on. And so the two extremes rule the roost, and that's where we're at, and so on. The unbridgeable gap. So we have to find ways to bring this together, and there the churches have to help. Now, if you understand Pope Francis and synodality, that's exactly what he's trying to do. So we have to bring people at table and just have them listen to each other. And they have whole rules how they do this, and how you have to sit at a table and everybody gets to speak and so on. But we don't do that. And our churches can't provide a space, a safe place to have a fight, So it never happens. Okay, then number 9. Sorry, I'm going to end up with the 11 commandments here. Jesus only gave you 10. Okay. We have to reach across the dividing line and wash each other's feet. So again, those who are at the workshop today, my apologies, this is repetitious. And this is John's gospel. We have 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And Matthew and Mark and Luke, they're kind of the same. And And they give Jesus, the story of Jesus, and, he is conceived and born and Christmas, and then the 30 years, and then he goes public, and the crucifixion, and so on. And they emphasize Jesus' humanity. John's gospel is written much later, much later, and it's a completely different gospel. But in the first three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper scene is one paragraph. The Last Supper, Jesus took bread, took wine, said, "This is my body, this is my blood, do this in memory of me." Okay. In John's gospel, the Last Supper is over half of the whole gospel. Over half of John's gospel is Jesus giving a long farewell speech at the Last Supper. And then, interestingly, no bread and wine appear. In John's gospel, no bread and wine appear at the Last Supper. Okay. And where the bread and wine appear in the other Gospels, a basin and a towel appear in John's Gospel. So John says this. I want to give you the text exactly. John said, "At the supper, Jesus, knowing that he had come from God and he was going back to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, took a basin and towel, and began to wash his disciples' feet, much against their protests. After he had finished washing, they put the basin and towel back. He put on his outer robe again, and he said, 'Do this. I did this to you, you do this to others. Do this in remembrance of me.'" What is that gesture? What is the gesture of the basin and towel, which is a Eucharistic gesture? Those of you who are Roman Catholics, when you go to Mass on Holy Thursday, we celebrate the institution of the Eucharist, and notice we don't read about the bread and wine in the Gospel. We read about the basin and towel. What's behind that? I'll give you a little history, and then we're going to try to tease this text out. Scholars estimate that John's Gospel was written somewhere in the mid to late 90s. Why that is important, if Jesus died in 33, that means Jesus has been dead for more than 70 years. Okay? And if John himself wrote that he would have been a very old man. He'd have been in his 90s. So here's an old man in his 90s, Jesus' beloved disciple, and he has seen 70 years of church life, okay? And 70 years of church life then is exactly like 70 years of church life now. They fought about everything. And especially they fought about the Eucharist. By the time John wrote his gospel in the 90s, they already argued what should it be called, who should preside, how often should it be happening. And John's gospel, John's community was celebrating it every day. Some were celebrating once a week. Some were celebrating once a month. A little bit like the scene today, So when John gets there, the old man, he's trying to make a point. He says, you know what Eucharist is? We got to be able to take a basin and towel and wash each other's feet. But what is the symbol? What's the symbol of washing somebody's feet? Now, there's two levels to this. The first level, and we get this level, it's an important level, that's servant leadership. The master washes the disciples' feet. There's something to be learned there. John Shea, who's also a poet, has a wonderful poem on this. He said, at the Last Supper, Jesus took the mantle of privilege and he turned it upside down into the apron of service. It's a great line. We get that. But it's an act of humility, but it's not just any kind of humility. There's humility that's clean and feels clean, and humility that doesn't feel clean at all. So as an example, imagine on Christmas Day, before you have your Christmas dinner, you go downtown and you help serve a meal to some homeless people. You'll come home at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock and take a shower, you'll feel pretty good. You've done something good and you'll feel good. That's servant leadership, okay? But there can be other kinds of, where you do something that's humbling that doesn't feel good at all. Let me give you an example. I've been talking about moral issues, the unbridgeable gap, the divide. I say, what's the most divisive moral issue in our culture? Abortion, by far, okay? You know what John would do if he came back, the beloved disciple? He'd say, let's not argue it at all. Let's bring out a basin and towel, and we'll get liberals to wash conservatives' feet. We'll get conservatives to wash liberals' feet. We're going to get pro-life people to wash pro-choice women's feet. We're going to get pro-choice women to wash some pro-life feet. Then we'll get Hillary Clinton to wash Donald Trump's feet. and we'll get Donald Trump to wash Nancy Pelosi's feet, and we'll get some Christians to wash some Muslim feet, and some Muslims to wash some Christian feet, and maybe we'll have Eucharist. Maybe we'll have community and unity down here, See, but when you wash somebody else's feet who's different, it doesn't feel good. He's not talking about physical. We got to reach across those lines. And, it's interesting why I gave you that text in detail. It's how he does it. Remember, John says, at the supper, knowing he had come from God and was going back to God, he got up from the table and took off his outer robe. What's the significance of that? Well, I guess that it doesn't get into the basin of water. No. That's a deeply symbolic meaning. What's your outer robe? What's my outer robe? I can give you mine. You know what my outer robe is? I'm a white, Roman Catholic, Canadian, pro-life, oblate, just go on and on, priest and so on. That's my outer robe. And when I'm wearing that, there's certain feet I can't wash. If I take that off, then I'm like Jesus. My only identity is, I've come from God, and I'm going back to God, and therefore all things are possible to you. Muslims, pro-life, pro-choice, But then notice he puts his robe back on again. It's not that those outer clothing isn't important. See, sometimes today you get spiritual writers who are so anti-dualistic, they point that out, but they don't point out he put it back on again. We need those clothing, but there's certain times you need to take it off. Make a confession as a priest. I have always hated doing that. You go to Mass on Holy Thursday, and that's really awkward. The people getting their feet washed hate it, and the priest hate it, and the people are uncomfortable. The priest is uncomfortable, and everybody's awkward. And you know something? That's the whole purpose of the exercise. There's no comfortable, unawkward way of doing this because it's meant to be awkward. It's meant to be uncomfortable. It was the first time they did it, right down to this very day, But that's a symbol. We got to reach across. If you're pro-life, reach across. If you're pro-choice, reach across. If you're a Democrat or a liberal, reach across. If you're conservative, reach across. That's reaching across to the other side. And it's awkward. It's painful. And notice the disciples getting their feet washed, they were also uncomfortable. Peter said, you can't do this, Interesting, I just saw a painting of that hanging in the Free House in St. Albert, and Jesus washing Peter's feet, and Peter has this uncomfortable look on his face. I don't like this at all. Okay. Now, two more, and I'll do them quickly so I have time for some questions and so on. Also, know that some demons are only cast out by prayer and fasting. It sounds like such a pious text. One time the disciples were unable to cast out a devil. Jesus came and cast it out. They said, why couldn't we do it? And Jesus says, some demons can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. Okay, and this happens to be one of them. Okay, but that sounds so pious. You're going to pray and God's going to convert Putin and they're going to stop shooting each other in the Middle East and so on. We don't know. But the prayer of fasting is first of all meant to change our hearts. It's meant to strip us of contempt. You pray and fast for world peace to change yourself, first of all. Hopefully God is also doing something to change hearts. But see, the prayer and fasting is to change ourselves. Need a little excuse to lighten this and put a little joke into here. We have to change ourselves. So this is an old joke, so forgive puns. So the Dalai Lama is in New York City, and he's hungry. He goes to a hot dog stand, and he says to the hot dog vendor, make me one with everything. Okay. No, but that's not the fun I'm getting to. But then he gives him $10, and he's waiting for his change. He said, what about my change? And the vendor said, change has to come from within. Okay. Well, change has to come from within. We pray and fast, not first of all to change the world. We're part of the world. We pray and fast to change ourselves. Okay. Then, number 10. Okay. Never forget that if you're numbering, I think I'm on, it doesn't matter. Okay, this is the last point, okay. Never forget the power of banter and humor as an important aspect of love. You know, this is serious business, and we're trying, but it also has to come with some banter. Okay. I was telling a group this afternoon, I was reading a poem in Commonweal some months ago. And I thought, I wish I'd brought it. But this woman, this was a delightful poem. She begins, says, she said, I'm an old white woman, and my life is pretty sterile. Says, and I don't have a lot of zip in my life. And at the end she says, because she said, I'm an old, crusty woman, said, and I have no banter in my life. What a great line. I don't have any banter in my life. Let me give you a biblical text. In John's Gospel, the wedding feast of Cana, that's a text we don't really understand much, okay? But they say, first of all, that's a story about Mary, more than about Jesus. Remember the text says, the mother of Jesus was invited to a wedding, and Jesus also went along. He was the tag-along, okay? They said, and at the height of the feast, she comes up and says, son, they have no wine. Full stop. They have no wine. Why wine? Wine isn't the protein. You don't need wine to live. If she had come up and said, I checked their fridge, they only have Doritos and Cokes. There's nothing healthy. There's no protein in this house. She says, basically, John is saying, she's at the center of life. She's telling her son, who's God, she says, I'm at the center of life, and it's flat here. They've got no banter. They've got protein, but they don't have anything else. The difference between protein that comes without banter, that's an image, but it's not abstract. If you go to any gathering, you go to any house, you go to any meeting, and in 10 minutes, you're going to know whether there's wine there or not. For instance, I go to faculty meetings, and sometimes they're good. You go, and people are upbeat, and they're laughing. Other times, they're grinding their teeth. And we're going to get protein done today, but nothing else. If you sneeze wrong, I'm going to kill you, or you go into a house and all is deadly serious and so on. We used to have a professor in Battleford, a good man, over serious, and somebody would tell a joke and he'd say, would you tell that in front of the Blessed Sacrament? Well, that takes the oxygen out of a room really quickly. Okay, there's no more oxygen left after that. See, we need banter. It's the grease of life. When you're in a family, you're in a marriage. I've lived for more than 50 years in a religious community of men trying to live together and so on, and men past 35 where we're all neurotic as hell and so on. But something? It works because we have banter. We also have prayer, which helps. But banter, there's teasing, there's humor, there's wisecracks and so on. It makes it flow. That's the grease of life. And that isn't just a negotiable aspect, Well, these people have a sense of humor or they don't, and so on. With this, if we're over serious with each other, let's you and I go have a deep conversation in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Okay, well, no, we need to be in front of the Blessed Sacrament. We need humor, we need grease, we need ease, and so on. That we have big problems to solve, but we're still alive. We still need to lead joyous lives and so on. And these people aren't demons. You need to have a glass of wine with them and so on. That we need banter. I was talking once to some alcoholics, and I said this, and one guy came up after, he says, what one of the most powerful aspects of AA is? He said, we go to the meeting, and the meetings are what they are, what an AA meeting is, and so on. He said, but after, he said, we sit around, and we shoot the fat, and we do this banter. He said, it's just wonderfully, wonderfully therapeutic. He said, sometimes just an hour of banter, he says, is better than an hour of therapy. You don't have to pay $100 for it either, and so on. Just the grease of life. This woman said, I'm an old, aging white woman, and I've got no banter. Just my life is, I've got protein, but I don't have banter. She didn't say, look, I'm dying from malnutrition. She said, I'm dying from lack of wine in my life. And that's the image in Scripture. They have no wine. Didn't say, they don't have any protein. They've got wine. Now we also have to give protein. Someone said this afternoon, I teach catecheses and so on. Well, if you're preaching or teaching or something, you're also delivering protein. That is what you're about. But it's going to be delivered across lines when you do it with some banter, with some lightness and so on. Actually, gives me an excuse to end with a joke, and we have time for some questions. But this comes from my novice master, and French-Canadian, Hilaire Gagné, great man. But he tells this story. He said there was an Italian family, and their daughter was getting married, but they couldn't afford a hall. They couldn't afford a venue for the reception. So the priest said, well, use the foyer of the church, the entrance that's big enough. You can bring a cake in there. You can have a little celebration, have a little music in there, and that'll work well. But then the father of the bride said, what about liquor? Well, that stopped. The priest said, oh, no. He said, absolutely not. You can't have liquor in a church. And the father of the bride said, well, Jesus drank wine at the wedding feast of Cana. And the priest said, not in front of the Blessed Sacrament. He didn't. Okay. Thanks for laughing. Okay, we have about 20 minutes left here, and we have time for questions or reactions. And now I don't think we have a roaming microphone, or do we? We do, okay. Well, Lisa's got it back there with a microphone, so if you raise your hand or wave or whatever, and she'll give you the microphone and you can react. Give you time. Because if the session ends early, I'm not going to get paid. And so,
Thanks. Father, this afternoon you said that the water that Jesus used was the cleansing water, that they had the 6 jugs of water for cleansing, and that he didn't do the drinking water into wine, he did the cleansing water into wine. What is the significance of that?
Okay, thanks for pointing that out. Let's go back to the wedding feast of Cana. So Jesus tells the stewards to fill these jugs with water, okay? And he turns them into wine. First of all, it was a lot of wine, okay? When you went into a Jewish house, they had 6 jugs, and they were all 18 gallons. So what's 6 times 18, okay? But that wasn't water for drinking. They didn't have indoor plumbing. So that was water for washing yourself, your hands, your feet, and so on. That was the wash water. And this is the water that Jesus changes into the wine. Like he didn't change the drinking water into the wine. He changed the wash water into the wine. What's the significance? Reconciliation. When you went to a Jewish house, there was a ritual that had to be observed. You weren't able to go to the table. You were considered unclean to go to the table unless you washed your hands and feet in these jugs, okay? And that's the way you were to the table. So what scholars call a replacement miracle. Jesus is replacing the way of cleansing yourself. The table represents heaven. And the way you go to heaven, you cleanse yourself, and that wine becomes the wine of the Eucharist. So I don't know how it is in all Protestant evangelical churches, but in Roman Catholicism, the primary sacrament of reconciliation is the Eucharist. And that cleanses you in order, that's the new way you wash yourself to go to the banquet table. So those are significant miracles. But those are details you can easily miss, that it wasn't the drinking water he changed into wine. This was the wash water. And see, those things, they all symbolize something. Other questions, comments? Up here, there's somebody. Wait, she's coming with the microphone.
Thank you. I've been reading some articles about Bishop Strickland, and the Pope has essentially let him go from his bishopric. And like, how does this fit into the stories you just told us in the 11 commandments, so to speak?
What fit into the stories of?
Well, Bishop Strickland is somehow he's not excommunicated, but he's no longer the bishop of
Tyler, Texas, yeah.
Yeah, Texas. So, like, what's the background? Is the Pope off the mark? Is Bishop Strickland off the mark? Like, what's happening in there? Or do you even know?
Well, I do know, but... Okay. No, this wasn't a decision that Pope Francis took lightly. And I mean, I can speak because a lot of this is in the papers. It's in public forum, so I'm not, disclosing anything and so on. But Bishop Strickland has been problematic, I can put it gently, with the U.S. bishops in general, with the Pope in particular. He's challenged the Pope's authority. He's questioning whether Pope Francis is legitimate. And the Pope didn't do this lightly. First of all, he sent a commission of 3 bishops into the diocese to do a study, to talk to the people. And these 3 bishops recommended that Strickland be asked to resign. And if he's asked to resign, he's asked to be removed, And so that, I don't know all the ins and outs, but it's, I don't want to use simplistic language of liberal conservative. He's very conservative. No. It's not so much conservative. It seems that he was tying a lot of ecclesiology to politics and the Republican Party and so on. But also he was pretty openly defiant of Francis, and openly critical of the American bishops. When they voted on the document, the Eucharist, which he had provoked to get written, but then Archbishop Gomez of Los Angeles was the chair of the use. He got them to write a very, very good document, because the last thing he wanted was that this document would divide the American episcopacy or the American church, But the intent of the 4 bishops who were pushing this document was to write a document that Joe Biden couldn't go to communion. That was the intent of the document, But I don't know, there's like 220 U.S. bishops. They voted for the document 218 to 4. He was one of the 4. That'll tell you something, Now, he's a very sincere man. He's a very Christian man. He's convinced that the church has taken a wrong turn. He's convinced the synod is the worst thing for the church and so on. He's convinced of that, so I respect his sincerity. But, at the recommendation of many of the U.S. bishops and the Pope, should he be leading a diocese? That's the question, And, people can land and say, he was unfairly treated. He was pretty defiant, And so if the Pope is your boss and you try to stand up to him, and if you get fired, you shouldn't be surprised. Can I put it just that simply, If you tell your boss, I don't think you're legitimate, I don't agree with anything you do, and you end up getting fired, you might want to look at why you got fired, No, that he's a sincere man, he's a good man, he means well, he has a lot of supporters and so on, goes without saying. That he was highly, highly divisive, that also goes without saying. And, and today we're talking about just divisiveness. Like, the last thing you need is a bishop who's simply going to polarize and divide a diocese and try to do it to the country in that way, And so I know I'm coming down on the side of the Pope here, but, well, maybe it's a safe place to come down. Up here, microphone is, you're giving Lisa, you're giving Lisa a pretty good workout here, okay.
Do you want to go first? I have a question too. Okay. Father Ron, could you help me and many of us to understand what has happened within our church where so many people want to return to the Latin Mass? Can you give some explanation of the process or how that kind of happened? Because it's very confusing to me. Good
question. Why are so many, well, first of all, it's not so many. But it is significant. There's significant movement, but it's not like the majority of Catholics want the Latin Mass. It might be 5%, 8%, or so on. Now, I want to treat this with sympathy. First let me speak against the Latin Mass, then I want to speak for it. See, we can live with a false illusion that Latin is a sacred language, that it's a special language, that's the language of the church. That's not true at all, And incidentally, that's where Christians differ from Muslims and so on. See, in Christianity, there is no, normative language. For the Muslims, there is. You can only read the Quran validly in its original language. But I'll take you to the Pentecost scene. In Acts 2, Pentecost. Luke says, who wrote that, he says, they came out of the Pentecost room and everyone heard them speaking in their own language. Notice he doesn't say everybody suddenly understood Greek and Latin. Everybody heard them in their own language. Christianity is a language of translation, a religion of translation, which means every language is equally valid. So Latin isn't privileged, that it's some kind of a sacred language. No. Every language, be it whatever, Bedouins in the Sahara Desert, all languages are equally privileged within Christianity. Now that's against the Latin Mass. For it, there's two reasons for it. And they both have some validity. Not for everybody. First of all, for instance, we've had a Latin Mass for almost 2,000 years. And during that time, we've had some great songwriters. So we have a treasury of spectacularly beautiful music, which we don't play anymore, It's as if you suddenly stop playing Mozart, you suddenly stop playing Beethoven, See, some of this Latin music is absolutely classic. It's brilliant, So some of these people are saying, we've lost something classic, we're we're overreacting to our past. Say, I don't want the Latin Mass. There's just treasures of beauty. We started translate the Mass only in the 60s. So songwriters, bless them, they've been writing English songs now for about 65 years. Well, try doing it for 1,900 years. In 1,900 years from now, we're going to have some beautiful English songs, We have some already, but, 1,900 years, there's just this treasury of art and of beauty, and of ritual. Okay, 1,900 years of refinement. That's kind of the aesthetic reason, but I'll give you another reason. A lot of people today are looking for roots, and they don't have any roots. See, and that's where they're different from many of us in this chapel. I grew up with a lot of roots, okay? Richard Rohr always says this, and he could speak for the rest of us. Richard Rohr said, I grew up in rural Kansas. He said, Roman Catholic, conservative. He said, everything explained, these powerful roots. And he said, something? It's the most wonderful thing in the world. He said, now I'm free for the rest of my life. When you have roots, you're free. There's so many young people today, they have no roots. I work with young seminarians, a lot of them, they have no roots. They're trying to grasp onto something, whether it's Latin, whether it's something. I've had young people in spiritual direction say, Father, show me something old. I'm so sick of novelty, and I'm sick of something that changes every day, He said, show me something old. See, so the instinct is, I want to have roots. This is 2,000 years old. It's got deep roots and so on. Now, whether it actually does that, I don't know. But that's the itch. That's the thing. And with that, those are the younger crowd. But there's an older crowd who are convinced that that's the reason our young people aren't going to church. So they say, if we went back to the Latin, people would start coming back. So there are three reasons. And they each have their own. One of them is the aesthetics. And that's a compelling reason, But it doesn't have to have a Latin Mass. We should be singing some of those Latin hymns. They're beautiful, 1,900 years of music, you get some good music. Okay, secondly, we have to find ways for some young people who are religiously driven to find roots, because they haven't found it in their families, they haven't found it anywhere, okay? So they're looking for it in the Latin Mass, okay? I have less sympathy with the third group, who are people my age and so on, are saying, like, if we go back there, all the young kids are going to start coming. No, I don't think we're going to have trouble, with over-church crowding. But now, John Paul made a ruling there, and Benedict and Francis mitigated somewhat, and that is this, that they said English, or the vernacular, French or whatever, the Spanish, they said, the vernacular is the normal, ordinary way you worship. And Latin is an extraordinary rite. So notice the difference. You do it by exception. You do it as extraordinary thing. You don't do it as the normal rite. But see, that is where sometimes younger priests, or priests, not just younger priests, they're trying to make it the ordinary rite. And one of Francis's concern, like Francis knows Latin better than we do, and so on, loves Latin. His concern of kind of rein it in was not concerned that there's something wrong with Latin. He's concerned about division of the church. You don't want a parish with two kinds of parishioners. You have your English people, you have your Latin people, and never the twain shall meet, So he says, like, parishes, they have to work this in unity. And so in that sense, the vernacular is ordinary. You can have permission for something extraordinary, and so on. One of our priests who teaches in our faculty, he's older, and he was trained in Latin, and he's good at it. He's also a liturgist. But he tells the story. He said he was approached by a group of people, said, "Father, you know Latin. Could you have Mass for us in Latin?" And he said, "Well, why do you want Mass in Latin?" They said, "Well, because we don't understand it." He said, "Let me say it for you in Spanish, if that's the problem." No, the whole thing is, and I'm not saying this facetiously. When I joined the Oblates, in my first 2 years, I eventually learned Latin, but not very well, not like I know English. But, we would say the office of the church in Latin, and we'd sing it and so on. And something? It's majestic. It was just majestic. And then we got English translations. We were horrified. These beautiful psalms, all of a sudden you're bashing kids' heads against the stone, and, and the psalms are full of violence and everything else, and say, they don't sound as good in the vernacular. But that's in fact what we're praying. If you don't know if you're bashing kids' heads against a stone in Latin, you don't know what you're singing, it sounds nice. It doesn't sound as good in English, But it's not something that, I have no sympathy for, and so on. I have sympathy with the aesthetics of this. And also, you see, I think the Vatican II generation, of which I'm a part, we've overreacted. We've overreacted to some of this, to Catholic devotions and all this garbage and so on. No. There is rich, long-standing stuff. We have to be able to, a lot of times it's both and, where you say, English is my language, but sometimes they can sing a Latin hymn, they'll bring tears to your eyes, because it was written by an artist of the Michelangelo caliber, and so on, or by Mozart, and so on. So that we need to respect that. And then also, I respect it more in young people when they say, I just need something that isn't shifting, that isn't moving all the time. I love that expression, show me something old, show me something old. I know everything that's new and it's moving too fast. I want to get off that train. I have less sympathy with people say, if we do it, we're going to fill our churches again. Now, you people have kids and grandkids. You think they're going to come back to Latin Mass? You answer it. I'm an old celibate with no banter. Okay.
Hi. I'm going to return to your comments about, or the commandment about hospitality, and thinking of not just the hospitality that Jesus extended and that we're called to extend, but is about receiving hospitality, as in Luke, where Jesus went to the home of the Pharisee. So first of all, that he was willing to bridge that divide in going to the home of someone who was, quote, other side, same crowd that John was calling a brood of vipers, and that he was willing to eat with them, to receive it. And I think there's something there in the bridging of a divide as well, is receiving as well as I'm going to be compassionate. I'm going to be the one who's reaching out to you. is to accept it from the other way. And I'm interested in your thoughts.
Good point. Good point. But no simple answer to that question. You know, what are our resistances to love and hospitality? And we have them. You know, it's not just, that it isn't offered. Notice with Peter, Jesus says, I want to wash your feet. Peter said, never, never, never. Why? Maybe more than anything else, that's what he wanted. See, so it's hard to just accept love, and for two reasons. Sometimes they're usually on both parts. Oftentimes it can be partly on the giver, where there's a gift that's being given, but it's not free. There's a price tag to it. I'm giving you this gift and you're going to owe me now. And it's a way of, manipulating or whatever. See, very few gifts are given that they're free. It's just a free gift. There's no strings attached and so on. Because oftentimes we give a gift and there's strings attached. That's why we have a lot of exchanging of gifts in our culture. You get a $20 Christmas present, you got to be in that price range. You get a $200 Christmas present, you got to respond in kind and so on. See, there's a lot of exchange, but also, not just in giving, in love, oftentimes there's a self-interest. There's a self-interest. And we can't help it, I said sympathetically. You know what anthropologists say, and you can check this out. I can't check it out. They say, what the purest experience of love on this planet is. The purest experience of love you're going to have on a planet, anthropology, is not the love of inside of a marriage or love for your own children, is love of grandparents for grandkids. They say because it's pure. There's no self-interest. You can look at this kid the way God looked at the world and say, it's good, you're beautiful. And with everybody else, there's angle, there's tension, there's this, there's that. Now, some of you are grandparents. You can verify they're not verified. That's the purest experience of love on this planet, is for your grandkids. In your marriage relationship and in, other relationships, there's always tension. There's always some give and take. Okay, that's on the giving part. Now on the receiving part. It isn't easy to receive love unless you've been really loved wonderfully as a child. I'm going to give you an historic example. Thérèse of Lisieux, the little flower. You know why she is such an incredible person to read and accept? Because she was probably loved more purely than anybody that I've ever read about. She drew a lucky straw. She grew up in a family where she was just completely loved, and consequently, she could receive love. To the extent that we're wounded, we really struggle to receive love. So I'll give you an example I used this afternoon. Henry Nouwen. He's one of the saints of our time. He's one of the, he's the most popular spiritual writer in the English language in the last 70 years. And in many ways, he lived a pretty tortured life in some ways. He was loved. He was adulated. He was tenured at Harvard and Yale, and he was so popular he couldn't get students into his class. They were in the corridors, and he got invitations to speak everywhere, and he had groupies, literally groupies. And you know something? He couldn't drink any of it in. He was always, I'm this lonely, wounded person. Nobody loves me. I'm unlovable. Henry Nouwen would go on a stage, and I saw this once in Winnipeg, and he could simply wow an audience with his energy. He'd get off the stage, he'd break down and start sobbing. He'd say, somebody hold me, I'm falling apart, And he was like, nobody loves me, okay? Well, he said, Henry, you're the most loved person in the whole world, okay? Now, his story had a happy ending. So about 3 years before he died, he was living in Toronto, okay? And one day he was standing by a bus stop, and Henry was a bit of a klutz. He was standing too close, and a van went by, and the mirror hit him and sent him flying. And he was hovering between life and death for about 6 or 8 hours. Dead, alive, dead, alive. And in that, he had an experience of Jesus loving him. And when he came back to consciousness, his whole life changed. He said, I'm loved. I'm loved. He said, I don't have to prove anything. You don't have to prove anything. And that's when he wrote his powerful books at the end, where he wrote The Return of the Prodigal Son, The Life of the Beloved. He said, you're just loved. You don't have to do anything. But he had to have an out-of-body experience for that. Now, that's maybe an extreme example, but we're all a little bit like that. Unless you've been loved as purely and deeply as Thérèse of Lisieux, you're always going to have some, how lovable am I? And so people give love, and we can't receive it. We push it away, even though it's what we most desperately want, it's, because we're not convinced enough of our own lovableness that we are in fact lovable. So if somebody in the stature of Henry Nouwen says, nobody can love me, I'm this deeply wounded person, I'm not lovable. That's an extreme where there's a little Henry Nouwen in all of us. Unless you've been extremely, extremely lucky, and you, like Thérèse of Lisieux, and you come to adulthood and said, I have just been loved perfectly. Incidentally, what also you learn from her story? You can't be loved too much. You'll never spoil a kid by loving a kid too much. You can only spoil a kid by loving a kid badly or wrongly. Nobody can be loved too much. You can be loved badly, where there's some kind of angle or something other to it, But if the love is pure, you can just drench a kid with love. You can't love somebody too much. You can only love them in the wrong way, And I used that example. In fact, if you haven't read Thérèse of Lisieux, read her, She is 1 in 100 million, And that's why she's so powerful. She died at age 24, never had an education beyond grade 8, and wrote this book. It just stuns you. It's powerful. Maybe I shouldn't say this from the pulpit where I have to keep my language down, but I was telling people in the workshop this afternoon, we were talking about how do you sort out and ground yourself in life? And I remember a very close friend of mine had died of cancer in 2003, and he was in palliative care in Vancouver, and I'd send him that book. And a few days before he died, he phoned me, he says, that's the only book I can still read. He said, you read Thérèse of Lisieux? He says, she sorts out the bullshit for you. He said, and when you're dying, there's no more room for it, But, she's an example. She was just loved perfectly and purely. And a consequence, she could receive love. She could just drink it in without being narcissistic. So we have trouble drinking it in, and we also have trouble not being narcissistic. Because, like now when we're wounded people, Richard Rohr writes well in this. Richard Rohr says, all of the gospel, and I can end on this, said, can come down to one word. Jesus says, surrender. Surrender to love. Give yourself over. But that isn't easy to do. It takes a lifetime before you can just give it over. You give it over to and a lot of times we're only going to get there through a lot of brokenness. Remember that song by Leonard Cohen that everybody quotes now, where Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. So that basically, a lot of times, God's going to do it for us in aging, in debilitation, in strokes, in seniors' homes, and assisted living, and eating Jell-O at 4:30 in the afternoon. It'll bring us around where at a certain point you just surrender, you give it over. Great question. Okay, it is 8:30. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Lisa for inviting me, and Bishop Don for inviting me, and merci, thank you, dankeschön, gracias. Okay. Okay.
So, Father Ron, you talked about, ending early and not getting